the first webinar you run probably won't be very good, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work.
You might want to get a few hundred people on a live webinar. You might want to achieve a 10% close rate, selling £2,000 to £3,000 per sale. That could be your model. I think a good webinar should leave people with something at the end. A client of mine calls this the customer will be able to statement.
Giving yourself a commitment of 3 to 4 webinars are the biggest thing, because if you do one, decide it's not for you, you haven't done enough yet.
Does marketing and content creation ever feel hard and time-consuming? What if it didn't have to be that way?
Join Rob Drummond,
Matthew Bliss,
and me, Pete Daly-Dixon, your ideal companions on the journey to a value-first approach to business growth, here on Help Before You Sell.
So I don't know about you guys, but my recording studio here is slightly porous and it's very windy today. So like, if you can see my hair waving in the breeze, that's it's because when we moved into this house, the room I'm in is actually a bit of like a ramshackle extension that the previous owners built, and at some point we need to knock it down and do it again. But yeah, if you hear rumbling wind in the background, then that's what it is.
Matt, welcome back.
Thank you. Yes, I was just observing the wind myself to see how windy it is over here. Just too different, despite how close we are, me being in Ireland and you guys being in the UK. But yes, I'm just off the back of a night away to relax while the teachers get their week off. Almost zero impact on me, but very grateful to have a night away.
You know what the opposite of relaxation is? Running a webinar.
You're a pro. You're a pro, man. What a segue, Jesus.
It's a bit of a sledgehammer segue. But, if you want to know what real stress looks like, try running a webinar and then realizing about 3 minutes before the session starts, you've got 29 people in the waiting room. You can't find your laptop charger. The light on your laptop isn't working properly. You can't find your earphones. If earphones are going to go missing, that's the exact moment. And then you've got to come onto this session and act collected and act like you know what you're talking about and perfect your pitch when it comes along. And I think it's a tough gig.
The reason you mentioned that, of course, is because that's the topic
today. Yeah. I mean, just for anyone following along with these episodes, we've been going through different ways that you can help before you sell. We started off with one-to-one meetings, consultations. We're kind of working our way out. So we've been through networking, we've been through live events. And it felt to me like webinars were kind of a logical next step from live events, and that it still is a live event. And people actually started running them instead of doing live events because they kind of figured, instead of paying for a conference room and having all of these overhead expenses and actually getting everyone to travel, I could just get them to sit on an online session. And I remember the first time, so my first ever webinar experience was for an employer, and we put on a lunchtime webinar for our existing client base. So this was a software company, and the webinar was about a new software feature. And I worked in the marketing team, and I was like, nah, no one's going to give up their lunchtime to listen to us talking about product inventory or something. And then all of a sudden, 12:30 rolled around, and all these people started showing up online. I was like, wow. So,
what did you learn from that?
Well, I learned that people would show up if it's the right topic. And I think in hindsight, it kind of makes sense to me because I've also partnered with enough companies now where I've had enough. So I'm thinking about things like Infusionsoft, for instance. I've been through the partner training. I've had enough skin in the game so that if the vendor turned around and said, we've got a new feature, we're running a webinar on it at this time, we'd love to get your feedback, and be like, you know what, I might show up.
Yeah.
My next major experience with webinars was for a subsequent employer who used it more as like a bridge between sales and marketing. And actually their main marketing strategy was to get people to a live webinar. They had some automated webinars as well, but mostly they were doing live webinars where they were trying to get a few hundred people onto a live webinar. And I might have told this story before, but my role as head of marketing was to manage the list. So again, we were using Infusionsoft. That was the bridge in. That was my connection in. But I had to manage the list, make sure everyone received the correct number of invites, got people registered, build up a registration list, and then nudge those people to actually show up to the webinar. So send a certain number of email reminders, text message reminders. So it was multi-channel. Think about what content we might publish before the webinar to entice people. This is a bit of a teaser of what you'll learn, of what you'll get out of the session. Quite a lot of moving parts to get right.
Does it?
But it did work. So that was their main strategy. It was mission critical, but they kind of knew that because they've been running webinars for a while. It wasn't a one-time gig. It was a long-term thing that they were doing here. And they kind of knew their numbers pretty well. Like they knew that if they had a few hundred people live on the webinar, well, in fact, I mean, we kind of knew the short routes as well. So we kind of knew that if we had about 500 people registered, we'll probably get about 200 to 300 people on the live call, depending on the topic, depending on how hot the topic was, really. Quite a lot of it depended on the topic. For, say, a few hundred people on a live webinar, again, it varied a little bit by the topic, but for our core things that we did, we reckon that the peak was about a 10% close rate to people signing up for the offer. And the offer was a £2,000 to £3,000 investment.
Right on the back of the webinar, so no sales
on the webinar, yes. So the call to action on the webinar took you to an order form that was, again, an Infusionsoft hosted order form, and people entered their credit card details.
Wow.
And we had a bit of a nightmare with people sometimes not being able to enter their credit card details and having to deal with that. So we used to do quite a lot of automation of figuring out, well, if you clicked on the link, we're going to put a tag on you, in the system, so we know that you were going to be followed up with tomorrow by the sales team.
So with all those moving parts and all that potential stress, and the listener might well be someone who doesn't have someone else who's responsible for all the stuff that you said that you were responsible for, why would anyone choose to run a webinar?
You might want to get a few hundred people on a live webinar. You might want to achieve a 10% close rate, selling £2,000 to £3,000 products per sale. That could be your model. And it doesn't have to be those numbers. It could be that you have 100 people registered, 50 or 40 people show up, and 5 people even take you up on the offer, and maybe they work with you directly. So for the offer that we were doing, it was a course-based thing. So people booked onto like a live training course to come for a few days. So it depends on what you're doing. But if you're working with someone, like, the numbers might just be smaller. But you might have that. The reason that we did webinars and the reason webinars worked was because it was quite an effective bridge between marketing and sales. So if you're doing a lot of the marketing stuff to warm people up, and you've got the email list, you've got the ongoing emails, you might have various social activity going on. You might have, so we also had a book. You might have multiple books. You could have a print newsletter. So you got all of that stuff warming people up. But at some point you need them to say, okay, I'm going to show up to this. I want to learn about this topic. I'm interested in this topic. I want to solve this problem. The time is right. It's a bit of a litmus test of figuring out for who is the time right. Because if the time is right for them, they'll show up. And if the time is right for them, and they've got the belief in that problem, and they've got the money to solve it, and they've got the decision-making capability, if those planets align, then they'll probably be in the 5 or 10% of people who. So
we're talking about something going back to the funnel or kind of orbit thing we were talking earlier. It's further down or further up the ladder. It's further up the ladder.
Yeah, I mean, I have done a bit of experimentation promoting webinars to new contacts, so people who weren't already on the list. It can work to a degree, but it's got to be a really hot topic.
I think of it a bit like a triangle. Like, looking back at our old stuff, that the previous episodes where we've talked about things before. In that funnel episode that we discussed it in, we pitched that the one-to-one meeting at the bottom of the funnel can't be the only thing that you've got. It's not your highest offer or nobody else. We want to make sure all of the rooms are opulent. And this kind of sits in the middle of that, where it's you in front of a larger number of people. And like you said, Rob, you probably want them warmed up a little bit to be ready for what you're going to talk about, because it's not going to be specific and directed to them. All of the aspects of the webinar, I think, fall into a triangle of things where you can have different levels of each of the 3 points. Those 3 points being the amount that they're comfortable coming to the session in either anonymity or comfort level with what you have to deliver. There's the convenience for them. It may be inconvenient if they don't know enough about you to come to one of these things. And third point of the triangle would be the comfort level for you, your ability to construct a session and have it appeal to the kind of sale that you want to make the content broad enough to cover potentially 100 people coming to the session and appeal to them, but also adaptive enough that if people are coming to the session with different ideas, that they can kind of infer what they need and realize what you're selling them as an advantage to them. And all of that together sounds a little bit convoluted, but I equate it to the you can't have something fast and cheap and good. You kind of have to pick two of those three usually in product design or whatever. With webinars, it's kind of the same. You kind of tune up the dials of each of those 3 points that I mentioned to optimize.
And it's the same. It's the same with this. The same with anything. The first webinar you run probably won't be very good, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. The first podcast episode you produce, if you're doing it on your own, it's probably not almost certainly not going to be as good as the 10th one or the 100th one that you produce. But how does the listener know whether this is a help before you sell strategy, which is going to be worthwhile there? Because I imagine also that the consistency piece comes in as well, that it's not something that you just do as a one-off. There's got to be a commitment to, to do them over a certain period of time. How many is that? How long is that time that's worth giving it a crack at? Yeah, those are some of the questions that come to me on behalf of the listener.
Yeah, I would commit to doing 3 webinars. It really tests your professionalism now. If you've ever had to do a webinar and you've not really promoted it properly, you've missed some of the steps, you haven't understood all of the moving parts, and then it looks like no one's going to show up and you've kind of got away with it, you're going to have the night off, and then 2 minutes in, someone shows up and you're like, oh man, I'm going to have to do it. I'm going to have to do the presentation. Like, that really tests your professionalism. Especially if they then leave after like 30 minutes. No, not that this has ever happened to me, of course. I think bringing it back to a help before you sell lens, I think a lot of people either try to help too much in a webinar. They pack it too full and it's like, it's a fire hose and it's too much, or the topic is too broad. They've heard that webinars are supposed to be about 40 minutes or an hour, and they've got about four hours worth of material in it. So that's one thing. Or they don't help enough, and it's a kind of a thinly veiled sales pitch, and the help is a bit sketchy. So it's just a hot topic. Yeah, come and learn about. So the hot one was GDPR a few years ago. Like, if you run a webinar on GDPR, every man and his dog would show up. But again, it was a lot of webinars that were either like half a day seminar packed into one, where I was like, yeah, this is like make my head explode. Or it was a thinly veiled pitch to sign up for someone's service. So I think my experience with this was that we also did test the content quite a lot, and the length of the webinar actually does depend on the offer that you're making. So for a relatively low value, so say in the hundreds of pounds or dollars, I would probably stick to about 40 minutes to 60-minute webinar. Perhaps 60 minutes, but allowing sort of 30 or 40 minutes of content. And then you obviously want to allow time for your pitch and to allow time for questions and so on.
Yeah.
Well, for the employer that I mentioned, where we were selling £2,000 to £3,000 products, we kind of found that 80 minutes was about a good sweet spot. So you would get a drop off in attendance after the hour mark, but everyone who was seriously thinking about buying did stay on. So actually that was a good litmus test of like, who's really interested. I've done enough raving in my life to know that when you get to about 4 a.m, all of the fun ravers kind of just go home, and between 4 and 6 a.m, you're left with like the real the real ravers, and that's what it's like. It's like last man standing almost. So
the ones that absolutely will buy a kebab as they leave the nightclub.
That's it. So yeah, if you got a high value thing, a high value offer, I would be tempted to say, okay, you are going to get a drop off after an hour, but what your offer merits a slightly longer session. And that doesn't mean that you cram it with, again, the 4-hour half-day seminar crammed into 80 minutes. Like, no. That's, again, what we were talking about last week on live events was that it's got to have space.
You've got to have space. Yeah.
That space could take different forms. It could take breakout rooms. It could take even just space for them to do some work, or give them a task to think about and then come back and contribute in some way. You might ask them to participate. I think a good webinar should leave people with something at the end. A client of mine calls this the customer will be able to statements. So what will the attendee will be able to do this. And it's not going to be the full thing. They probably have to hire you for that or take the program or whatever, but they should leave with more than just the sales pitch.
Well, you've got to help. Otherwise, you're not helping. This is help before you sell, not sell before you sell.
Well, last night I watched a video from Ed Lawrence's YouTube channel. He's a guy who tells creators on YouTube how to build businesses off the back of YouTube videos. And he was having a chat with someone from Course Builders Academy about his advice. Like, it was a 9-step model for things, but one of those steps was to build the minimum amount of content that solves a problem you've defined with the to maximize that result. And I think that's what you're talking about there. If your offer is only relevant to 30% of the stuff that you're talking about, and the rest is just you flexing how much you know, picking the webinar direction to solve a problem, or it might not be a problem they know they have, but you'll convince them and optimize it for the entirety of that thing. That might be a good frame to think about too.
Yeah. And what about promoting these bad boys, Rob? Any advice for the listener?
Yes. So you do want to ask people to register. Just having a link somewhere that they can join, it isn't really enough of a commitment. I would get them to register, get them to add it to their calendar. I would assume that when someone registers, that's kind of like a soft indication of interest. Like people add events to their calendars just to kind of put it in as a holding thing.
Yeah.
I would consider them 25% registered, and you want to kind of get them up to 75% registered. So the pre-event comms actually matter quite a lot. And if you think about a lot of the pre-webinar communication to people sent, often it's just like the automated Zoom ones of like, starting in 24 hours. Help before you sell. Starting in 3 hours. It's like, okay, well, that's better than nothing.
Well, my calendar does that though.
Yeah, exactly. That's a fairly low bar. It's worth bearing in mind that your webinar is competing with everything else that is going on for that person, including watching the football, or if it's an evening thing. We did quite a bit of testing too about time of day, and again, it varies by clients, but either kind of lunchtime, midday-ish, or even later in the evening can work depending on the audience. If it's kind of something that people kind of are interested in.
Going back to another episode is like market knowledge trumps marketing knowledge. You got to know your market. You got to know who you're dealing with.
But yeah, don't lead with your own assumptions. Just because you would never join a webinar in the evening doesn't mean that your audience won't. You have to again. So this is why it's worth running 3 webinars, because if you run one webinar and botch it up, and you've made a fairly big misassumption about your audience and what they want, so either the topic or the time of day, or the customer will be able to statements, or you didn't send out any reminders, you just assumed everyone would show up. Like, oops.
Yeah, just treat it as an experiment, just as everything else that we're talking about. But you've got to be serious about it. You've got to, you can't run an experiment one time and extrapolate from that one.
Yeah, from that one thing. So I think in terms of the experimentation, there's almost like 3 parts. There's the initial presentation and positioning of the webinar. What's the title? What's the promise? What's your sign-up page? All that kind of stuff. There's the follow-up comms that get people then to actually show up for the thing, because otherwise your show rate's going to be, it's either going to be the Pete Daly-Dixon fan club, etc., that actually show up. But if you want people to show up, then you need to be sending. So where we got to with this was, again, it kind of varies a bit based on the audience. But if I was running a mission critical webinar, I would be sending 2 or 3 emails on the day itself. We found that sending a message 15 minutes, 10 minutes before it started, saying, I'm on Zoom now, we're up and running, this is what we're covering, the ship is sailing. I know you're busy, but it'd be great to see you online type thing. Something that else that has helped, again, not with every client, but with some clients, is asking for their mobile number on the registration form and saying, we will send you a free SMS reminder. That's all you'll receive from us. We won't phone you. We'll just send you the reminder when it starts, and you can join on your phone if you want. So try to make it easy for people, because people will forget. Even if they're interested, people will forget.
Just to cut across, do you keep reminding what the customer will be able to? Do you keep kind of focused on that?
Yeah, don't just send them a reminder saying, "Oh, it's." I mean, you could do that. So we're starting in a few hours, but you've got to keep reminding them why they should give up their time. Each reminder is also like a selling opportunity for selling them on the commitments to show up. So that was the second optimization point. The third optimization point is actually on the webinar itself, of like how long it is, how much do you cover, where do you include the pitch. Something that we ended up doing was partly through the webinar, you'd give away certain freebies if they stay so long. So if you stay, for 45 minutes, then we're going to give you a free copy of our book or something like that. Obviously, that offer comes after you've introduced the pitch. So there's certain things that you can do to keep people on. So so there's all sorts of variables on the session itself. For some clients, we actually saw a better conversion rate by having one person present the content and a different person present the pitch, because some people are better at presenting what they know and the mechanics of it, and they kind of fall apart when it comes to saying, okay, this is the offer. And when we come to run our webinar, that's probably something we'll do. Piece like I sort of envision that I'll do more of the presentation. I'll probably kind of monopolize these podcast calls, so it'll be a similar pattern that I'll kind of rub it on and talk about the mechanics of it, and then I'll let you present the offer. Inviting
participation, of course. You're walking the talk.
yeah. But it might not be you presenting all of the session. That's another. Yeah. It's another variable. You then got, I guess, the fourth thing would be post webinar follow up, and I think people tend to assume that more people are going to kind of watch the replay, and people don't really watch the replay. I'm afraid. If people are going to buy the products, they're going to show up live. If they don't show up live, that's a big red flag for they're not interested right now. You might get a few sales. I mean, it's still worth offering a replay. As a limited time thing, do it as a 40-hour replay or 3 days, 72 hours, and then take it down. You might get some people do that. I've always been a bit baffled about the difference of saying, okay, because a webinar is just an online video, really. And yeah, you can spice it up. You can have breakout rooms and participation and so on, but it's still just watching a video online. And I've always had this thing of like, well, why is the conversion rate so different to just putting a video on a web page? Because if you just put a video on a web page, it's kind of the same thing, except it's not, because people don't watch it. But I think it's because it's a live event, and if you miss the boat, you can't participate in this. It's a live delivery on a promise that you made to help them with something.
And talking about being live, we're kind of using this Help Before You Sell podcast to kind of build our own aeroplane on the way down. And as a result of last week's episode, we've now got a date in the diary for Activate Your Podcast Live. Date and time is set, place and content to be determined, maybe Brussels, maybe Amsterdam, whatever. But we need, one of my beliefs is the more you talk about something, the greater the chance it has of becoming real. So, we can start talking about Activate Your Podcast Live, 20th to 22nd of August. So let's do the same with this. It seems to me that we should probably schedule a webinar and come up with a sexy title and start promoting it.
Was it John Taylor Gatto who said something to the effect of, you should teach the things that you most need to learn? Because I feel like that's kind of what we're doing here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I might have misattributed that to John Taylor Gatto, but someone wise said that. So
yeah, absolutely. If you, I think it was Richard Feynman as well, the physicist, said if you want to learn, teach. That's the most effective way to learn stuff. I haven't run it past you, but I do want to give a plug and a shout out to two friends of all of ours, Angela Tai and Christina Castro, because they've recently they do most of their sales on the back of webinars. So they have iterated. I think they've gone through like many hundreds of versions of their webinar. That just shows their commitment to the consistency. And they have recently compiled, like in the last week, compiled everything that they've learned to be true about webinars and put it into a low ticket item of their flagship offering, Ignite Your Offer. And they cover things like the 3 essential ingredients for a high converting offer, the webinar evolution, coming up with the webinar title, concepting your webinar content, event promotion and management. There's only so much that we can do in half an hour. But what we can do in that half an hour is we can point you to a resource which we know is going to be top drawer because of the people that have produced it, and also because of the results that they've had in their business as a result of doing what they're teaching in that content. So we'll bang the links in the show notes and do that for them. So if your interest is being piqued by webinars and you think that you might want to commit to running 3 or 4, that resource there will give you a much better start out of the gate than attempting to figure stuff out on your own, or just going from our ramblings on this episode. We kind of want to whet people's appetite, and that there are other resources out there that people can plug into.
I think as well, like running 3 or 4 webinars, going back to something we were covering in a very early episode, it's a great way to at least examine your own thoughts. It's a commitment to examine both your topic and your thoughts, and that's a good outcome by itself.
And I guess for us, the webinar we're going to schedule and run the webinar before our live event, won't we?
Yeah, that's right.
So that's part of the, like in 12 months' time, when we look back at the process which we're making up as we go along, it's like get a date in the diary for a live event, 4 or 5 months in the future, and then schedule a few webinars between where you are now and there, so you can start to examine your thoughts and go through the process and find out what that customer will be able to that really engages the audience. Then when you come to the live, promoting the live, you know that you've got content which really resonates with your ideal audience.
There's been something niggling at me throughout this entire conversation, mostly because of my background, but I know that there are questions people are asking. That part of the reason we've done this episode the way it is and talked about what we have is that they largely don't matter. Like, what should my Zoom background be? What platform do I pick to distribute these things? How do I do it well and construct the PowerPoint in a way that's going to make sense? How do I get the right microphone to make sure that my voice sounds awesome? Do I need a DSLR camera? Like, there is very low level questions that arise when this comes up. And besides saying, like Rob did before, practice, do a couple of things before you get started, I want to tease that we'll probably do an episode around the webinar talking about what we went through to get it set up. But also, and this is probably destroying the illusion a little bit, but if people are curious about how we set up the webinar and would like to infer from what happens behind the scenes and see what the webinar is like that we do to practice the method, like see us doing the thing, reflect with us on what works and what doesn't, then they should sign up for the webinar and watch out for closer to the time when we do an episode talking about those specific things and the impact they have on the structure of the session.
Good call.
Yeah. Because I am very aware that we could do another full 30-minute episodes talking just about the technical stuff that we know doesn't have as broad an impact as what we've talked about today. It's better as a tease,
Major takeaways?
I think you can achieve traction, again, without going through a lot of the technical stuff and agonizing over the right webinar platform and whatnot. I mean, yes, I will say that the right webinar platform does make a difference. Going back to what I was saying earlier, like you are going to want to tag people, for instance, who click through to your offer. So therefore, it should integrate to your marketing automation or email marketing system. These are some considerations that you might want. It doesn't stand alone as a standalone system. It is part of your systems.
But the ideal thing, I think, is that the system you pick sets constraints for you to practice the things we've talked about today. So, Pete, the main takeaways for me, I think, are setting your content to deliver what you want and don't make it overwhelming, and practicing and testing giving yourself a commitment of 3 to 4 webinars are the biggest thing. Because if you do one, decide it's not for you, you haven't done enough yet. Give it a go a few times and make sure and that gives you a chance to practice the platform, make sure it gives you what you want, work within those constraints to see if you can build the best webinar session you can.
You don't stop trying to walk just because you fall over.
That's right.
You keep going.
Probably more swimming. I think that's, less necessary in our gravity-filled environment.
My one takeaway, I mean, hopefully this was clear from what I've said, but make the topic more focused than you think it needs to be, and cover about half the ground you plan to, and see how it sits with your audience.
Leave them wanting more.
Nice one. Here endeth this lesson.
Okay.
On the next episode of Help Before You Sell.
On the next episode, Matt, we're going to move on to the topic that you and Pete have been itching to cover, trying to get to this entire time, which is, of course, podcasting. So,
podcasting, what's that?
I think it's videos on YouTube. I think
is that what people are making money off now?
Next episode.
Next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Help Before You Sell, sponsored by Activate Your Podcast. To activate your podcast and help the people who most need you and your services, head to activateyourpodcast.com/help. If you found this episode helpful, please also leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And remember, help more to sell more. See you next time.